Hello, my name is Assadullah Samadi from the Faculty of Veterinary Science, Kabul University. Today, we want to talk about risk mitigation strategies. This program is designed and supported by a Global Health Development Organization. So now, we want to discuss how we can reduce the level of risk associated with biological materials inside the lab or any health facilities. So here, in this presentation, we want to discuss about the strategies of biorisk, how we can reduce or mitigate the level of risk inside a lab. When we are talking about the risk, it's biorisk. It means biosafety risk and biosecurity risk. So what is the biorisk mitigation? Biorisk mitigation is the controlling or reducing the possibility of accidental exposure or unauthorized access to harmful biological organisms. So what does it mean? It means how we can protect ourselves inside the lab from biological agents and how we can protect biological materials from others, from the peoples. Generally, there are 5 strategies of biorisk mitigations that can be applied to reduce the risk levels to an acceptable level. We can use one or all the 5 strategies at the same time. Mitigation is most effective when it is based on risk assessment. So first of all, we have to do the risk assessment to identify the most important biohazards and threats. Then based on the biorisk assessment, we can apply the mitigation strategies to control or to reduce the level of risk on an acceptable level. Meanwhile, the effectiveness of risk mitigation could be affected by the ability to implement these strategies on the lab or any health facility. So what does it mean? So first of all, we have to do the risk assessment. Then, based on the level of risk, we can apply the risk mitigation strategies. Then we have to have the ability to implement it. So, in this regard, we have to do the risk assessment first to identify the biohazard and threat. Then we can do or apply the risk mitigation strategies, then to evaluate it, it's working or not. The simple model for biorisk management is the AMP model: assessment, mitigation, and performance. In the assessment, we will identify the risk, then we will identify the hazard and threat. Finally, we will evaluate the likelihood and consequence of the risk associated with the hazard and threat. In the second stage, we will reduce, we will control, we will mitigate the risk associated with the biological materials. So we can do elimination or substitution, engineering control, administrative control, practice and procedure, and use of PPE that we are discussing today in this lecture. Finally, we have to evaluate the effectiveness of this biological control or biorisk control? Is it working the way it was designed? If it was working, then we have to consider the continual improvement of the situation inside the lab to keep the risk level at it is. So now, what is the biorisk mitigation? Simply, we can say controlling or reducing the possibility of accidental exposure or unauthorized access to harmful biological organisms, specifically microbes, with the use of safety equipment, personal protective equipment or PPE, and behavior practices. So biorisk mitigation or biorisk management could be done as follows. First of all, we have to identify the biorisk inside the lab. So it could be biosafety risk assessment and biosecurity risk assessment in the same time. Most of the time, the lab manager will consider biosafety risk assessment but forget biosecurity risk assessment. Both of these are equally important. Then, based on our risk assessment, we can mitigate. We can control the risk. So again, it should be biosafety risk mitigation and biosecurity risk mitigation. The process is called biorisk management. So now, if we do these steps, we can manage biorisk inside the lab. So why it is important to conduct a risk assessment prior to implementing mitigation controls? Why it is needed to do first risk assessment, then to apply risk mitigation? Other question, what outcome would you expect? Would you expect when you mitigate, when your mitigation is based on a throughout risk assessment? And the last question, what would you expect if mitigation is implemented without conducting risk assessment? So we have to answer these questions before going further with this presentation. First of all, when we do risk assessment prior implementing mitigation control, what would be the benefit? Save the money. Why? Because when we are doing risk assessment, we will identify the most important biorisk inside the lab, then we can control it. We can reduce the level of risk. So we can save the money here. Another good things about risk assessment prior to implementing mitigation control is better safety. So we have to identify hazards to protect the lab personnel from it. So if it is identified during risk assessment, it is easy to control it. Also, it will help you select the right mitigation strategies. Meanwhile, risk may go unrecognized if you do not conduct risk assessment per your risk mitigation. Also, without a risk assessment, some risk may go unaddressed, while other mitigation control may be inappropriate, respectively. The second question, what outcome would you expect? when mitigation is based on the true risk assessment? What do you think? I think all of the above answers that we have previously in the previous slide. The last question. What do you expect if the risk mitigation strategy is applied without a risk assessment? The opposite of all the above answers. We will lose the money. The risk may not be controlled properly. The risk may not be identified properly, and everything may go wrong with our all strategies. Generally, there are 5 categories of risk mitigations: elimination substitution, engineering control, administrative control, practice and procedures, and PPE. So, to reduce the level of risk that is not acceptable in the lab, we can apply most of the time all or most of these control strategies to reduce the level of risk on an acceptable level. What is the first strategy? Elimination or substitution. What does it mean? It means removing the hazard or not working with the agent, or sometimes replacing the hazard with something less dangerous. For example, if you are working on a field strain of Bacillus anthracis, the causative agent of anthrax, on a lab, you can change it to a less virulent strain. This is called substitution. Sometimes you may do culture of an organism, replace it with a safe method like serology. So this is called elimination. Or some of the time we may completely close a lab techniques inside a lab that is not acceptable. Like if you want to do culturing of Brucella, you may need biosafety level 3. But if you do not have the facility of biosafety level 3, simply we can close the project. We do not have those things to protect ourselves from biological material or to protect biological material from the people. So the risk is not acceptable. Just close. Here we can have a good example. Cigarette without smoke and cigarette with smoke. Everyone know now that if you do smoke, there are many risks associated with the smoking. So how we can say something to the smoker to not smoke? It is very hard for him. So we can substitute the real cigarette with the new one, the electronic one. So easily the smoker will change his habit using the harmless cigar instead of the harm one. This is called substitution. Another strategy, engineering control. It is physical barrier to isolate the hazard or threat from the employee or staff to secure materials. So here we can do anything to make a barrier between the lab staff with the biohazard, or between the people from outside the lab with the lab. So in biosafety context, here we can implement engineering control to make a barrier between the staff and biological materials. But in biosecurity context, we can make a barrier between the biological material and people outside the lab to control access, not to enter anyone in the lab without our permission. The third strategy is administrative control. This is policies, standards, guidelines, SOPs, and other guided materials to guide the people to protect himself from biological material or to protect biological material from the people. The fourth one is practice and procedure. Procedure in activities that has been shown to control or reduce the level of risk if it is practice. So here we have to do anything to change the habit of people inside the lab to protect themselves from the biological materials and to protect the materials from the people. Like not doing mouth pipetting is a procedure that is shown to be effective in reducing the level of risk for the staff inside the lab. Or closing all the time the door of the lab will control the risk of access the people not to enter the lab without our permission. The last one, PPE. It is the device worn by the worker to protect against hazards in lab. But you have to remember, we cannot change the PPE with the administrative control. Some of the PPE is also engineering control. But it does not mean we have to substitute engineering control with the PPE. We cannot do it. Engineering control could protect the people from the biological material, also meanwhile could protect biological material from the people. So it can do both things. Biosafety mitigation and biosecurity mitigation. But most of the time, PPE is just used in biosafety context. It just protects the people from biological material, but not biological materials from the people. So we say that we have 5 general strategies of risk mitigation: elimination or substitution, engineering control, administrative control, practice and procedure, and PPE. Could you please write the advantages and disadvantages of these 5 general mitigation strategies? Please write your answers on a paper. We will collect the answers at the end of the class. So you have 5 minutes to answer or to write the advantages and disadvantages of these 5 general mitigation strategies. So now check your answers with these answers. The most important advantages of elimination and substitution is it will immediately reduce the level of risk. So when we apply the elimination or substitution strategy, it means if we are not working with the hazard or we change it to a less virulent or change the procedure, so it will immediately reduce the level of risk. This is the most important advantage of elimination or substitution. But most of the time we cannot do it. Most of the time it is not available to do the work with less virulent. Or most of the time we cannot close the project. We have to do it. For engineering control, the advantage is it's most efficient. It will eliminate the hazard or control the threats immediately. But it is high, it's costly, and most of the time when we are applying it, it's complex, it needs training. All the staff may not use it properly. The administrative one, it is authority approach. So it needs training, guidelines, standard, SOP. So its disadvantage is it will indirectly control the risk, not directly. Sometimes the one who wrote the guidelines, the standards, he may not be familiar with the real situation of the lab, so it will misguide us. The situation will be not controlled. Practice in procedure is all the time, it's done based on SOP. It's easy. Do anything, it's written recipe. But it needs continuously the training and supervision. So we have to control that the lab worker is doing the things that is written on the SOP or not. Finally, PPE. It is device worn by the lab worker or staff inside the lab. So everyone can use or wear a lab coat, a gloves, a goggles. Also, the cost is not high like engineering control. It is relatively cheaper than the engineering control. But PPE will not eliminate the risk. In some time, even it will spread the infection to others, to the families, even to the environment. So we have to consider the advantages and disadvantages, all these 5 categories when we are using it to reduce the level of risk. So now, from the previous discussion, let's please now categorize these 5 categories of risk mitigation strategies from the most effective one to the less effective one. It means 1 is most effective and 5 is least effective. So please categorize the 5 general mitigation strategies from 1 to 5. What will be the first one, the most effective one, and what will be the least effective one? Please write your answer on a paper and then we will collect it. So now, please check your answer with the real situation. The elimination is the most effective one in controlling the risk inside the lab. So it means we will not work with the hazard. The second one is substitution. Changing or replacing the methods or biological material. Then the engineering control is the important one. The third one is administrative control. The fourth one is practice and procedure, and the final one is PPE. So what does it mean? It comes from the most effective one to the less effective one. But you have to remember, it is harder to implement. From this side, it is easier to implement. So we have to do in parallel. Consider the implementation and then the effectiveness at the same time. So we have to do anything to control the risk, but we have to consider the situation, how we can implement it. So here is harder to implement, but easier to implement, but most effective in controlling the risk, less effective in controlling the risk. So at the same time, we have to consider the implementation and effectiveness of strategies that we want to apply to control or eliminate the level of risk inside the lab. Also, you have to remember, we cannot do anything to reduce the level of risk in zero. It is not possible anytime. So we have to do anything to reduce the level of risk to an acceptable level. This is our main goal. So now we can compare the PPE that is used for a motorcycle safety and engineering control for a driver inside the car. So let's check the PPE for a motorcycle. You may have these PPE when you are driving a motorcycle, but let's compare it with the engineering control that consider the safety for the driver. Check here the skate from the back. So what do you think? If this driver have an accident, what will happen to the driver? Most of the time it will be safe. Look here, the barriers that will save the driver. But what do you think if the motorcycle driver have an accident? Do you think this PPE can protect the driver of the motorcycle completely? I don't think so. This is the same thing with the PPE you are using inside the lab, comparing with engineering control. So engineering control is most effective in controlling the biorisk, biosafety and biosecurity risk inside the lab than PPE. Most of the time, PPE inside the lab is working worsely. It means when you are working inside the lab and you are using a gloves, so all the time you have to have the gloves when you are working. Most of the time the lab worker will answer his phone, mobile, doing the pen working, then touching on hand, nose. Sometimes some of the staff even may take the lab coat or other things to the home. So it will carry all the infectious material to his families, friends, and all the time with inside the population. So based on this, PPE is less effective than engineering control. So now we can conclude, when implementing mitigation control, you should first consider elimination or substitution. But if it is not possible, a combination of control measures should be used based on our risk assessment. So if we do the mitigation control based on risk assessment, the mitigation will work effectively and it will be very less cost. Since most of the time we cannot use elimination or substitution strategy, so the most important one could be engineering control first of all, administrative control, practice and procedure, and the last time PPE. So now it is the time to answer the following question. You can check or answer from these multiple choice questions. More than one answer could be checked. Like the first question, the main objective of Biorisk mitigation could be reduce biosafety risk, reduce or control biosecurity risk, reduce the hazard and threat, and all of the above could be checked. So please read the question from the slide, answer it, and in the final we will check your answer with the real answers. Thank you so much from your attention. So any question? Thank you.